Wake up, same as always, 6:14 before the alarm. Lie there in the dark, listening to the house. Karen's still asleep on her side, facing away, which is how it's been for longer than I can remember. Used to reach over, not anymore. Get up, make coffee, stand at the kitchen window watching the neighbors' sprinklers run their cycle. This is my life, and I'm not complaining, just describing it accurately. I work in logistics management for a regional distribution company. Middle of the org chart, comfortable salary, not exciting. Karen teaches elementary school part-time. Stopped working full days about 3 years ago when she said the stress was affecting her health. I didn't argue. We own the house outright, bought it 9 years ago, put a significant down payment from my inheritance when my father died, refinanced twice, paid it off 4 years ago. Also have 2 investment accounts I've been contributing to since before we met, a 401k and a business I started on the side about 6 years ago that I never told her about because I started it as a creative outlet and it slowly turned into something real. The business thing wasn't a secret out of malice. It just started as nothing, and by the time it was something, I'd gotten used to it being mine. That distinction will matter later. Nothing about this Tuesday is different from any other Tuesday. Coffee, shower, pack my lunch because Karen stopped making it about 2 years ago, drive to work, do the job, come home. Karen's on the couch with her phone when I get back. She does this thing where she angles the screen away before she looks up. I noticed it, but filed it under nothing because people are allowed privacy. Dinner's not started, which happens about 4 nights a week now. I make pasta, eat at the table while she eats in the living room watching something on her laptop with earbuds in. This has been normal for a while. Go to bed, she comes in later. We sleep in the same bed like 2 pieces of furniture that happen to share a room. Wake up, 6:14. Do it again. The first thing that actually snagged my attention wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday about 2 months ago when I came home and she'd cleaned the whole house. Not just tidied, actually cleaned. Baseboards, the inside of the microwave, the windows. Karen hasn't voluntarily cleaned anything in 2 years. We have a service that comes every other week, and even then she doesn't pick up before they arrive. I stood in the kitchen and felt something I couldn't name. It was the feeling of something being staged. Didn't say anything, just noticed. The next thing was the gym. Karen joined a gym in March, which I knew about because she mentioned it briefly and I said that's great. She'd talked about getting in shape before, nothing ever came of it. I assumed this was the same. But she actually went. 3-4 times a week, started packing a bag the night before, started coming home at odd hours saying traffic was bad near the gym.
I didn't say anything about the traffic part, but I clocked it. Our gym is 4 miles away. There is no traffic between 10 a.m. and noon on a weekday that adds more than 4 minutes to that drive. Still didn't say anything, just started paying attention. The phone thing got more pronounced. She used to leave it on the counter when she showered. Now it comes with her to the bathroom. Used to leave it charging in the kitchen overnight. Now it charges on her nightstand with the screen face down. None of these things mean anything by themselves. I know that. I'm not an idiot, and I'm not paranoid. But I'm also someone who works in logistics, which means pattern recognition is basically my job function, and patterns were forming. The next piece was money. I handle our finance, have since the beginning. Karen has never been interested, and I've never minded. We have a joint checking account for household expenses, and she has her own checking account where her school income goes, which I don't monitor because that's her money. What I do see is the joint account, and in April, I noticed the grocery spending went up. Not dramatically, but consistently. Our grocery average for the prior 2 years was around $380 a month. Reasonable for 2 people who eat at home most nights. April was $590. May was $610. This could be inflation, I thought, because inflation is real and grocery prices genuinely went up. But I started paying attention to what was actually in the house. Same amount of food, maybe slightly less. I didn't say anything, just started keeping my own quiet record. Around this same time, I noticed she'd been to the pharmacy 3 times in 6 weeks. I saw the charges on the joint card. She picks up her prescriptions from there, antidepressants she's been on for 4 years, occasionally allergy stuff. But 3 times in 6 weeks meant either a new prescription or she was buying other things and paying with the joint card. Still nothing dramatic, still just pieces. The thing that shifted my internal state from observing to calculating was a Thursday afternoon in late May. I came home early because a vendor meeting got canceled and my afternoon cleared. Karen's car was in the driveway, so I knew she was home. I came through the garage, set my bag down quietly, and heard her in the back of the house on the phone. I didn't hear words, just her voice, and what I heard wasn't the tone she uses to talk to her sister or her friends from school. It was a tone I recognized from a long time ago, from before things got quiet between us. I stood in the kitchen for about 30 seconds, then I walked normally down the hall like I hadn't been there, and she stopped talking. By the time I appeared in the doorway, she was sitting on the bed with the phone in her lap, face carefully arranged into ordinary. I said, "I got off early." She said, "Oh, okay." That was all. But the tone I'd heard and the face she was wearing when I found her didn't match each other. And that was the thing that changed my operating mode from passive observation to active, quiet preparation. I want to be clear that I didn't know anything at this point. I had a pattern of behaviors that could have innocent explanations, but I've been in logistics long enough to know that when a pattern looks like a problem, it is usually a problem. You don't wait for the shipment not to show up before you call the carrier. You see the flags and you start working the contingency. So I started working the contingency. The first thing I did was call my accountant. I've had the same accountant since before I got married. a quiet, methodical man named Gerald who has done my personal and business taxes for 16 years. I told him I wanted to schedule a review of my financial picture, not the business specifically, everything. He said sure, and we set a lunch for the following week. I told nobody I was doing this. At lunch with Gerald, I laid it out plainly, not the emotional stuff, just the structure. I want to understand exactly what I have, how it's titled, and what would happen to it in a divorce scenario. Gerald didn't blink, because Gerald has seen everything. He said, let's go through it. The house, both names on the deed. We paid it off using primarily my income and my inheritance, but it's been held jointly for 9 years. In our state, that creates a presumption of marital property, regardless of origin of funds. The investment accounts, 2 accounts, one opened before marriage and contributed to before and during, one opened after marriage, both in my name only, but still considered potentially divisible because of contributions made during the marriage. The 401k, marital asset, straightforward. The business, this is where it got interesting. Gerald reminded me that I started the side business before we were married, that the initial capitalization came from my own premarital savings, and that Karen had never been involved in or informed of the business at any point. He reminded me of these things in a very deliberate way that made me understand he had thought about this scenario before. Gerald is a careful man. He said the business's status in a divorce would depend on how a court valued it and whether Karen's attorney could establish that marital funds or labor had contributed to it. The answer to both of those was complicated. The business had grown during the marriage, which courts in our state count as marital appreciation in some circumstances, but Karen had never contributed to it, never known about it, and I had been meticulous about keeping its finances completely separate from our joint life. Gerald said, I'm not a divorce attorney. You should speak to one, but from an accounting perspective, the paper trail on the business is clean. He said this the same way he says everything. No drama, just information. I said thank you and paid for lunch. That evening, I found a family law attorney. I didn't search from our home Wi-Fi. I went to a coffee shop 3 miles away and used their network on my work laptop, which has a different usage history than my personal devices. This is the kind of thing that occurs to you when you work in a field where documentation and process matter. I found a woman named Patricia who had 30 years of family law experience and whose firm was in a part of the city Karen had no connection to. I called from the coffee shop parking lot, got an appointment for the following Thursday, drove home, made dinner, watched TV with Karen, who sat at the opposite end of the couch. Nothing about my face or voice had changed. This is important, I think, to understand about how I was processing all of this emotionally. I want to be honest here, because I think people expect a story like this to be full of rage or devastation or dramatic internal collapse. It wasn't. What I felt was a kind of slow, cold clarity, like a morning when the fog burns off and you can suddenly see the whole landscape. I wasn't happy about what I was probably looking at. I'd been with this woman for 14 years, married for 11. There were years in there that were genuinely good, but the grief of the marriage had already been happening for a long time, in small, quiet increments, and by the time I was sitting in that coffee shop parking lot, it had already mostly run its course without me fully naming it. What I was feeling now wasn't hurt so much as focus. Thursday, I met with Patricia. She was exactly what I needed, direct and comprehensive, and not interested in my feelings about it. I laid out the structure of assets, and she asked questions, good questions, pointed ones. At the end of the hour, she said, "You're in a reasonable position, but you need to act on a few things before anything gets filed." She said, "The most important thing right now is to make sure your records are clean and your business documentation clearly establishes the premarital origin and independent operation." She said if she doesn't know about the business and you've been filing separately for it, that's actually a complex situation, and the outcome will depend heavily on how it's characterized. She told me some other things I need to be careful about documenting. She told me to stop depositing any personal funds into joint accounts beyond what was needed for household expenses. She told me to start building a clear record of contributions I'd made to the marriage from premarital assets, which Gerald could help with. She said, "Don't confront. Don't change your behavior. Don't let her know anything has changed on your end." She said this like it was advice she gave often, and meant it every time.
I paid the retainer that day, drove home, made dinner. Karen asked how work was. I said fine. She said that's good. Over the next 3 weeks, I did a series of things that were each individually unremarkable, but collectively constituted a careful repositioning. The first was the business. I had a conversation with my business attorney, a separate person from Patricia, a man I'd been working with for 4 years on contracts and structuring. I told him I wanted to review the business's corporate documentation. Specifically, I wanted everything that established the founding date, initial capitalization, source of startup funds, and ownership structure to be organized and clearly labeled in a way that would withstand external scrutiny. He said sure, and I spent an afternoon in his office going through 6 years of records. Everything was clean, because I'd always kept it clean, but now it was organized with intention. The founding documents clearly showed I'd started the company 8 months before Karen and I got married. The initial funding clearly traced to my personal savings account, which predated the marriage by many years. Karen's name appeared nowhere in any document in any capacity. This wasn't new information. It was existing information, now properly organized. The second thing was the investment accounts. I spoke with Gerald again about the one I'd opened before the marriage. He helped me build a clear accounting of what the premarital balance had been at the time of the marriage versus what had been contributed since. In our state, there's a concept of tracing, where you can potentially protect the premarital portion of an asset if you can document it clearly enough. The account had grown considerably, but the original premarital balance and contributions were traceable through records. Gerald built out a clean document showing the history. The third thing was the house. Patricia had been direct about this. The house is probably going to be the cleanest marital asset to divide, and I shouldn't try to hide it or manipulate it, because that would create legal exposure. What I could do was document clearly that the down payment had come from my inheritance, and that the payoff funds had come primarily from my income. That documentation wouldn't necessarily protect the asset in full, but it would be relevant to equitable distribution arguments. Gerald had the estate records from my father's death. He pulled together a timeline showing the inheritance, the transfer to my personal account, and the subsequent down payment. This was all real, all documented, nothing invented. I just now had it organized. The fourth thing was something Patricia suggested that I hadn't thought of. She said, start keeping a quiet log of household contributions. Not obsessive, not retroactive fabrication, just a contemporaneous record going forward. What you pay for, what you handle, what you do in the house. She said, in equitable distribution, evidence of one spouse carrying the majority of financial and domestic responsibilities matter. I started a simple log on a password-protected app on my work phone. Daily entries, brief, factual, bought groceries, paid electric bill, handled insurance renewal, fixed the backdoor threshold, scheduled the HVAC service. Things I'd always done. Now, documented. Karen's actual contributions to the household were limited at this point, which was fine. I wasn't angry about it. It was just useful to have recorded. Now, here's where I need to describe what was happening on her end during these weeks, based on what I was quietly observing. The gym trips had settled into a regular pattern, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday mornings. The phone behavior continued and actually became more elaborate. She started putting it in her purse when she sat down to watch TV, which was new. The mood in the house, which had been neutral cold for a long time, shifted to something that I can only describe as slightly performative. She was occasionally warmer than she'd been in years, asked my day with a little more interest than usual, made dinner twice in a week, which hadn't happened in months. This kind of warmth from someone you suspect of planning something is a particular type of uncomfortable feeling. It's like watching someone shuffle cards and smiling at you. I smiled back and ate the dinner and said it was good. I also noticed she'd started using the home computer more. We have a desktop in the spare room that mostly sits unused. I had no intention of snooping through her browser history because I didn't need to, and because anything I found that way would be inadmissible in any meaningful sense, and would also change the dynamic in a way I wasn't ready for. But I did notice the computer chair had been moved, and there were coffee rings on the desk that weren't there before. The pattern was filling in, but I still had no hard confirmation of anything. I didn't need hard confirmation to keep doing what I was doing. The preparation didn't require proof of wrongdoing, it just required prudence. In mid-July, something happened that crystallized it.
Karen mentioned, very casually over dinner, that she'd been thinking about going back to teaching full-time in the fall. She framed it as wanting to be more active, wanting to feel productive. She said she'd already talked to her principal and there was a full-time position available. I said that sounds like a good idea. And it does sound like a good idea, but the timing registered. Someone who is building toward independence establishes income before they need it. Someone who is planning to stay in a comfortable situation doesn't suddenly prioritize employment. I said nothing about this reasoning out loud. I said I was glad she was feeling motivated, and that was the end of the dinner conversation. That same week, I quietly began moving a portion of my personal liquid saving. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do here, because I'm not interested in describing anything illegal or fraudulent. I did not hide marital assets. What I had was a personal savings account that had been in my name only since before the marriage, and had received only post-marital deposits from my personal income, kept separate from our joint finances throughout the marriage. I moved a portion of that account to a new account at a different institution. This was my money in my account being moved to another account in my name. Not hidden, not fraudulent, just reorganized. Patricia had been clear about what constituted improper dissipation of assets versus legitimate management of personal property. I was on the right side of that line. I also talked to Gerald about the business valuation. In a divorce, the other side would try to get the business valued as a marital asset. If it was classified as marital, the value I'd built over 6 years could potentially be split. Gerald and I had a long conversation about the factors that influence how courts approach business valuation in divorce. The key factors in our state were founding date relative to marriage, source of initial capital, degree of contribution by the spouse, and whether marital funds had ever been commingled. On all four of those factors, my business was defensible. Founded pre-marriage, initial capital from premarital savings, Karen had never contributed anything or even known about it, and I had been obsessively clean about keeping business finances separate. The one soft spot was appreciation during the marriage. The business had grown from a small side project to something worth a meaningful amount. Some of that growth arguably happened because I was in a stable domestic situation that freed my time and energy. Patricia called this the indirect contribution argument and said opposing counsel would try it. She also said it was a weak argument in our jurisdiction without stronger evidence of actual contribution. I made sure there was no stronger evidence. August was quiet on the surface. Karen and I continued our parallel life in the house. She went to the gym, I went to work. We occasionally watched the same TV in the same room. She bought new clothes over the summer, several things, nicer than her usual choices. The pharmacy visits had continued. The phone never left her person. I kept my log. I kept my face neutral. I had a second meeting with Patricia in late August. She reviewed what I'd done and said I was in a better position than when we started. She said, "When this gets filed, and I think it probably will, be ready for the temporary orders phase to be contentious." She explained that in our state, a spouse can request temporary orders early in the divorce process that can freeze assets and establish temporary support arrangements. She said, "The goal is to have everything so well documented that the temporary orders don't create any surprises." She also said something I found interesting. She said, "In my experience, when one spouse has been planning this for a while and has legal counsel, they often file in a way that's designed to maximize leverage in the first 30 days. She said, "They move fast, try to get you reacting instead of acting." She said, "The best response to that is to already be prepared before they file, so you're never actually behind." I asked her what she estimated the timeline might be. She said she couldn't know, but that the pattern I described, the increased independence, the income establishment, the general pulling away, suggested someone who was in the late stages of preparation. She said probably within 60 to 90 days. She was off by about 2 weeks. September 14th, Karen served me. She waited until I was home from work on a Wednesday, which I suspect was deliberate, because a weekday arrival home is a vulnerable moment. You're tired, you're in transition, you're not at your sharpest. A process server was waiting on the front porch. Karen was inside. I took the papers, thanked the process server, went inside. Karen was in the kitchen, standing with her arms crossed, an expression I can only describe as braced. I set the papers on the counter, looked at them briefly, looked at her, said I'd review these with my attorney. Her expression shifted slightly, something she hadn't expected in how I was responding. She'd probably expected something more reactive.
I went to the bedroom, called Patricia's cell, got her voicemail, left a message saying the papers had arrived. Then I changed clothes, made dinner, and ate it. Karen stayed in the kitchen for a while and then went to the bedroom. I slept in the guest room that night. Not dramatically, just practically, because the situation had changed and there was no reason to maintain the bedroom arrangement. Patricia called back the next morning. She'd already been in touch with opposing counsel because Karen had apparently retained someone weeks earlier, and that attorney had reached out to Patricia's office in advance. Patricia said, "They're moving fast. There's going to be a motion for temporary orders next week." She said, "They're going to request temporary exclusive use of the marital home, temporary spousal support, and an asset freeze." She said, "I've been preparing for this since August. We're ready." I want to describe what the temporary orders hearing felt like from the inside. Karen's attorney was good, sharp, clearly experienced. She'd built a picture of Karen as the financially dependent spouse who had subordinated her career to support the marriage, who had limited earning capacity relative to mine, who needed immediate protection of the marital asset. It was a coherent picture, and it wasn't entirely false. Karen had worked part-time for 3 years. She did earn less than me. She had been, in the most technical sense, financially dependent on my income for much of the marriage. What Karen's attorney didn't know when she walked into that hearing was the degree to which I had spent 3 months making sure the picture she was painting would only be partially accurate. Patricia stood up and began introducing documents. The founding documents of the business, clearly dated 8 months before the marriage, the initial capitalization records tracing to my premarital savings, Gerald's accounting of the premarital investment account balance, the tracing documents on the down payment coming from my inheritance. Karen's attorney objected to several of these on grounds that they were preliminary. The judge, who was methodical and clearly experienced in exactly this kind of dispute, said she'd consider them provisionally. The asset freeze request was partially granted and partially denied. The joint accounts were frozen, which was expected.
The business was not frozen because Patricia had filed a preemptive motion arguing it was separate property, and the documentation supporting that argument was comprehensive enough that the judge declined to freeze it pending full classification proceedings. The temporary support request was granted in a modest amount, lower than Karen's attorney had asked for, because Patricia had introduced the evidence of Karen's full-time teaching position, which she had started in September. Karen's attorney argued the income was recent and shouldn't be weighted heavily. The judge said it was still income. The exclusive home use request was the one that I think Karen had been most confident about. She'd probably imagined me being ordered out of the house, having to find somewhere to live, being destabilized while she remained comfortable in our home. The judge declined to grant exclusive use at this stage, found that there was no domestic violence or safety concern, and that both parties had equal right to remain in the residence. Karen's attorney pushed back. The judge was polite and unmoved. I watched Karen's face during this. The braced expression from the night she served me had been replaced by something else, something doing the math and not liking the answer. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. I felt the particular quiet that comes when preparation meets the moment it was built for. The next several weeks were the procedural phase. Financial disclosures, interrogatories, the mechanical process of a contested divorce moving through the system. Karen's attorney requested full financial disclosure on all accounts and assets. This was expected and appropriate, and I complied completely. This is the part where the business became the central issue. Karen had not known about the business when it appeared in the disclosures. Her attorney had to pivot their entire strategy. They'd been building toward a narrative of a husband who controlled all the finances and kept his wife in the dark, which was partially true in the sense that I managed our finances, but the business's existence complicated the picture they'd been drawing. It was premarital, independently operated, and completely documented. Opposing counsel requested all 6 years of business financial. I provided them completely and without resistance. Gerald had built a clean, clear picture of the business's history that consistently supported its classification as separate property. Karen's attorney brought in a forensic accountant. The forensic accountant spent time with the records. I know this because Gerald told me and because Patricia had been prepared for this exact move. The forensic accountant's report was less useful to Karen's case than her attorney had probably hoped. There was a deposition in October. Karen's attorney questioned me for 3 hours. The questions about the business were pointed, and I answered them completely without elaboration. When did you start it? Before the marriage. Where did the startup funds come from? My personal savings from before the marriage. Did your wife know about it? No. Did she ever contribute to it in any way? No. Did you use marital funds to operate it at any point? No. After each answer, her attorney made a note and moved on. There was nothing to grab onto. I also answered questions about the investment accounts, the house, the savings. Gerald's documentation meant I could answer every question about the financial history of the marriage with specificity. I knew exact amounts and dates because they were in front of me in organized form. After the deposition, Karen's attorney requested a settlement conference. Patricia said this was a good sign. It meant they were reassessing their leverage. The settlement conference was in November. Karen's attorney opened with a position that was considerably more aggressive than Patricia had expected given the state of their case. They were asking for half the business value, half the investment accounts, the house, and significant ongoing support.
Patricia leaned over and said to me quietly that this was an opening position designed to anchor the negotiation. I said I understood. Patricia's counter was based on the documentation we had. The business as separate property, not divisible. The premarital investment account traced and protected as to its original balance and premarital contributions. The postmarital investment account divisible. The house divisible, but with a credit to me for the down payment from inheritance. Ongoing support at a modest level for a limited term, given Karen's now full-time employment. Karen's attorney rejected this and asked for a break. During the break, I sat in a conference room and drank bad coffee. I wasn't thinking about Karen specifically. I was thinking about how the house would feel emptier when this was done. Not in a grief way, or maybe in a grief way, but a quiet one. I thought about the morning light in the kitchen, which I've always liked. I thought about the 11 years and whether I'd been a good husband. And I concluded honestly that I'd been a decent one, not exceptional, and that whatever had pulled us apart was probably the accumulation of small neglects from both directions, rather than any single dramatic failure. This is a thought I had in a conference room during a divorce settlement break, and I mention it because I want to be accurate about what this whole thing felt like emotionally. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like closing something correctly. We went back in, and there were 4 more hours of back and forth. The final settlement looked like this. The business classified as separate property, mine entirely. The premarital investment account subject to a limited credit for documented premarital contributions, the remainder divisible. The postmarital investment account divided equally, the house to be sold with proceeds split with a partial credit to me for the down payment amount, which amounted to a meaningful adjustment in my favor, the 401k divided per standard QDRO, spousal support at a modest monthly amount for 30 months, not the indefinite support Karen's attorney had initially requested because Karen now had full-time employment income.
Karen's attorney tried twice more to reopen the business classification. The judge in the formal settlement review was not interested in relitigating what the documentation had already established. I signed the final decree in January. Karen signed the same day, separately. I didn't see her that day. I drove home afterward. The house was quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when they've been emptied of something. Most of Karen's things were already gone. She'd been staying with her sister since October. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the window where I'd stood every morning for 9 years, watching the neighbor's sprinklers. The neighbor's sprinklers were off for winter. I made coffee and drank it at the table. There are things I want to say clearly about what I did and didn't do in this story. I didn't hide assets, I didn't commit fraud, I didn't fabricate documents or create paper trails that weren't real. What I did do was recognize a pattern before it fully developed and organize existing, legitimate reality in a way that was as accurate and defensible as possible. Everything I protected because it was genuinely mine, genuinely premarital, genuinely separate, genuinely documented as such in real records that had always existed. I just made sure those records were organized and clearly labeled when the moment arrived that they needed to be. Karen's plan, as best as I understood it from the structure of her attorney's opening positions, had assumed a husband who didn't see it coming, who would be served papers and scramble, who wouldn't have counsel already retained, who wouldn't have the business documentation clean and organized, who wouldn't have the inheritance tracing done, who would be reactive, off balance, emotionally destabilized, making decisions from behind. And I don't say this with contempt for her. She probably had reason to believe that's how it would go, based on how things had been between us. I had not been a particularly alert husband in the preceding years. I'd been comfortable, maybe complacent, living inside the routines of a marriage that had quietly gone cold without my addressing it. The version of me from 3 years ago probably would have been exactly what her strategy expected. The version of me that watched the pattern and started working the contingency was a different operating mode. I kept the house. Well, technically the house was sold, and I got a larger share of the proceeds than I would have without the down payment credit. I used that to buy a smaller place about 2 miles away. I kept the business. The business is doing well. I kept the investment accounts in the proportions that had been traced and documented. What I lost, I expected to lose and had prepared for losing. The 401k split was fair. The post-marital investment account split was fair. The support amount was manageable and time-limited. I didn't lose what I hadn't expected to lose. There's something I think about sometimes. Not about Karen specifically, or about what she was doing or who she was doing it with. I genuinely don't think about that much. What I think about is the morning I stood in the kitchen and felt the house was staged. That feeling that something was being prepared around me, that something was being set in motion that I was supposed to walk into without seeing. I think about the gap between what that moment could have been and what it turned into because of one unremarkable Tuesday when I came home and the house was clean, and something in me went quiet and started paying attention. The neighbor's sprinklers came back on in March. I was standing in the kitchen of the new place, different window, different light. Same time, same coffee, 6:14 before the alarm. Some things don't change. Some things change completely. And sometimes the difference between those two categories is just whether you were paying attention at the right moment.